This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is romantic love, its pros and cons. I'm speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Title, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The topic is romantic love. I am speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Title. He is from drjeffreytitle.com. You can find him online. And I am speaking about romantic love, its pros and cons. Jeffrey has written a bit about that. And if I could ask you, Jeffrey, to take a couple of minutes, talk about who you are, how you got into, psychology, and what your ideas about love and romantic love specifically are.
Well, I am a clinical psychologist. I have a degree from Boston University in adult counseling, and going way back from the mid-70s. And since then, I have been a therapist, licensed psychologist in Massachusetts, and worked throughout New England. And also do couples therapy. I was director of group psychotherapy at Charles River Counseling Center for several years, way back when. And since then, I've done couples counseling. I wrote a book with my wife called Loving Smart that was published in '93, and we just are completing a book that we've been working on called Relationship Hygiene, which is sort of an update of the same basic couples material. And I have been studying with Terrence Real for over a decade now, in relational life therapy, they call it in his group. They do intensive couples therapy with a particular point of view that I've been following. So in my practice, I do intensive long sessions with couples who are in quite desperate straits. And it's also a consequence, however, my own marriage. So I have been married for 52 years and been with the same woman for 55 years. And a lot of what I know about romantic love I learned from us. So I started out early and worked at it since then.
Well, romantic love is often coupled with the idea of monogamy, and there are people who have suggested, both evolutionary biologists as well as some psychologists and psychiatrists, that monogamy and romantic love is more or less a modern invention, that human beings are meant to be polygamous or polygynous, and that this is just something that culture has imposed upon our natural state. What do you think of that in particular, that idea?
Well, one thing I think of it is that I don't know how we would know that, since we're so imbued with our culture that it's pretty hard to reach beyond the pressure of our own experience and our own culture. But I think there must be a lot to it. There's got to be more than what we have and what we see. And it's a big world, and it's been around for a while, so there have to be more than our way of going about it. But we have, as far as I know, since about the 50s or so, been quite caught up in a love by choice and romantic love, which I think economically wasn't a very viable option in the past, here or elsewhere. So that we may have gotten into it because we could afford to.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the economics of it, and if you look worldwide, there's still around the world in many societies, especially more third world societies, arranged marriages. Even here in the U.S., going back, over 100 or so years, and going back to Western Europe, there were arranged marriages. Brides came with dowries. One of the reasons that women have traditionally taken on the male name had to do with lines of succession, whereas in the last few decades, a lot of married women have retained their own birth names. Do you think that, have you, in talking about and in dealing with romantic love and the problems attendant to that, have you ever looked at what we would call the romantic love situation versus more traditional arranged marriages and relationships?
To the extent that a couple will come to see me who are the product of an arranged relationship. There are couples of Indian descent in America, particularly, who get married because of an arranged marriage and run into problems when they get to talk with them. So yes, I've had some contact with this. I would say that sometimes people who have arranged marriages fall in love.
Yeah.
So it doesn't preclude the whole issue of falling in love. It's just not amongst the expectations that are involved. In our Western society, we have a definite expectation that we're going to marry the person we fall in love with, that we're all going to fall in love, and we're all going to marry the person we fell in love with.
You talk about the expectation. One of the things that I think I find when talking with people who've been divorced or whatnot is sometimes I've said, well, they're really the nostrum that there's someone for everyone, in a sense, I think is kind of silly. I mean, I look at it as a typical person might run into 4 or 5 people that are possible long-term partners, and there are going to be those outliers, I think, that there's just no match for. But society seems to put on these expectations that if you're a 55-year-old male or a 60-year-old woman and you've never, married, and maybe only had 1 or 2 even brief relationships, that somehow you're a quote-unquote loser at love or a loser at life. Do you think that these kinds of social expectations bring undue burdens to people, and that sometimes they force some people to, get into relationships that are damaging?
Extremely so. And it's unfortunate because there can't just be one way of going about a life. Certainly, a life of romantic love has its own exceeding pitfalls, which I'm sure we'll discuss as we go along here. And the other lifestyle can be a lot simpler and lead to reward. The issue, on some level, in my mind, has to do with value and meaning. Does one have meaning in one's life, and where does one find that meaning?
Yeah.
So clearly, you don't have to have children, and you don't have to have a marriage in order to have meaning in your life. There are other ways around that issue. I do a lot of mentoring work where I talk with people who are already highly successful, and we discuss a lot of discussion is on the meaning of life. Is that all there is?
Yeah.
Phenomena. So, no, romantic love is not all there is. One kind of marriage is not all there is. Western thoughts are not all there is. But we're pretty mired in them, that's for sure.
Let me ask about some of the things that people would say. I mean, a lot of times you hear, especially it seems from women, and maybe I'm biased, but it seems that women are more susceptible to the idea of romantic love. And maybe that's just my bias, but I hear a lot of women, when they talk about having found their husband, say, or their long-term partner, that, he made me whole or something. And I'm always of the opinion that if you're saying that, these people don't even seem to realize you're saying that there's something wrong with you to begin with.
Well, I don't imagine there's any of us that don't have something wrong with us to begin with, or 1,000 things wrong with us to begin with. And there are ways that being in a close relationship can help us to feel better. But one of the myths of romantic love is that romantic love is going to change us or change that other person or solve all the problems in our life. And
Yeah.
of course, that is a naive expectation. Having expectations of things that are just not going to be can be very disheartening.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your myths, and on your website, you have 3, I guess, main myths. The first one being love conquers all. The second being love will change my partner. And the third is that romantic love lasts forever. Let's go through them one by one. Did you rank them 1 to 3 in terms of the perniciousness of the myth, or in what way are they ranked or enumerated?
I don't really know the answer to that, honestly. I think that it depends on how. It's hard to get into romantic love without falling into that, because we fall in love So we're going along and dating or not, and meet somebody and get that dopey, uplifting, hormone-driven feeling of romantic love, and then we just feel so good that we want to have that forever. A type of drug, self-inspired drug experience.
Yeah, and when you see the phrase like "love conquers all," I mean, certainly there are people who I would assume the marriage or the relationship breaks down, yet they still actually do love. It's not all bitterness. Are the relationships where the two participants, and this could be male or female or even homosexual love, uh, uh, are those relationships somehow more frustrating for you as an analyst to deal with because these two people obviously care about each other, but they can't make it work, rather than a couple where they're at each other's throats after 10 years?
The former are the kind that I like the best.
Yeah.
And when I'm interviewing a couple, we do very long interviews. And when I'm interviewing the couple, I'm looking for signs, and I'm asking specifically, were you ever in love? Did you ever have positive feelings? Do you still have any of those feelings? And I asked them what drew them together and about the romantic love phase. Because my deepest take on it is not that about all the failures of romantic love, but that people fail to keep on doing all the smart things they did while they were romantically in love.
And when you say smart things, give me one or two examples.
Listening.
Yeah.
So the couple's in love, they find themselves in love, and they're at the restaurant, and they're on their elbows, leaning forward towards each other, nodding positively, and listening and trying to help each other get their words out, and feeling very positive about each thing they're hearing. And then time goes by, and they get those juices aren't there anymore, and the listening is really for the purpose of understanding, and they forget to do that because their expectation was that while they were in love, they did understand each other perfectly. And of course, that's an absurdity.
Yeah.
We cannot meet somebody and in short order understand them perfectly or even imperfectly. We're not going to really get them at all.
Especially when you deal with heterosexual couples, the male-female divide in terms of expectations would seem to be something that sometimes proves insuperable. I mean, a good example I hear from women, my own wife included, but many from couples who have broken up, is that women feel a need to always hear their partner say, "I love you, you're pretty, you're smart, you're this, that, or the other thing, positive thing." Whereas with the male, it's like, of course I feel those things, and assuming we have a healthy, of course I feel those things. Why do you need me to say that every day? It seems silly. So is there a difference in the male and female expectation, and is that something that's maybe evolutionarily hardwired, or is that a cultural thing?
I think it's cultural, but I do think that if you think about that, what's up with the guys? Why in the world wouldn't it work for them in the first place? Why'd they stop doing it? Where'd they get the idea that that was enough? So you can't. I am sure that these very same gentlemen were, while they were madly in love and going through the dating phase, were saying and doing all those things to meet the woman's expectation. I can't imagine logically. I understand, psychologically why people do this, but logically, does it make any sense to stop doing it? So you get a new car and you've got the maintenance plan, and they say if you do that, it'll keep the car in great shape, and you start out doing it, and how long does it take before it falls by the wayside, unless you're one of those maintenance type people? So, the same thing happens with the car. It's getting grungy inside, you're not changing the oil as frequently, all the usual maintenance things. And relationships require high maintenance in order, a love relationship, if you wish to continue and have any hope for love in the future with that same person, it's a high maintenance activity. Yeah. And then people do all the maintenance while they're dating, and then give an example, I think, in the original book from '93, where this has really happened. So the couple does things together and has a fabulous time while they're dating, and then comes the honeymoon, and she gets up and wants to get ready to go play golf with him, and he's already in his clothes and out the door, saying as he leaves, well, you know, the pro is much better at it than you are, so I'm going to go out with the pro today. So the honeymoon, in a way, lasted till the next day.
Well, let me ask about, you had mentioned that one of the questions you first ask couples that come to therapy is, were you ever in love? And I think that some people probably never were, but you know, there was the cultural expectation. But what percentage of people think that they were in love, say when they were 25 or something, and they got together, but once they hit 40 or so, they realize, well, we never were in love. We were deluding ourselves. And what is the mechanism of that delusion, say?
Well, firstly, as far as the falling in love part of it, I always think of My Fair Lady, or when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, or the ground is not below my feet anymore. We all know that heady feeling, and I think a lot of people did have it. I think it does happen relatively frequently, and it's a much enjoyed emotion.
Yeah.
It is a relief, after all, to drop into or float up into this miasma of delicious, delightful feelings where everything's going right and everything's so wonderful for you. But I think that later on, life grinds on, and it starts grinding on. You say 40, but it depends on when the relationship starts. Because if you get married and then you start hitting the growth period of your career, and then there are children involved, and of course, straight couples and gay couples are raising children now. So it's a condition of being married, or not even being married, since single people do it. But you start having kids, and the kids are keeping you up at night. Your sex life goes by the wayside, and reality hits. There's no time for the relationship. Whereas when you're dating, there's all the time in the world for it, it seems.
Yeah. Let me just ask, because you just briefly mentioned it, just as a sidebar, have you done gay couples, male and female, lesbian and gay male couples, and in what way would they differ from hetero couples, and is there any difference between lesbians and gay male couples?
Okay, wow. There's a topic for you. Okay, I would say...
Just initial observations. We don't have to go that deeply.
Sure. In the marriage part of it, I would say there was not a whole lot of difference. There is an advantage to same-sex marriages because there's a certain degree of understanding.
Yeah.
From being in the same body and having the same social status growing up in the world. And so there's a certain degree of understanding. So when you fall in love and there's that sense of understanding between men and women, it's quite illusional because I don't think that either deeply get the experience of the other one in life as a man or a woman, whereas the same-sex couples have a terrific advantage in that regard. But when the troubles start, they're all the same.
Yeah. Now let me ask, because you had said that love relationships are high maintenance, and it's often the males who think that, well, we've been married now 5 years. I don't have to constantly say that, you're beautiful, I love you, etc. But the second myth, that love will change my partner, I would say that even most women would admit that they are the ones that have the biggest problem with this. Most women want to, if they marry, an Oscar Madison, a guy who's a slob, they immediately want to change him into Felix Unger, the neat freak. Or, if the guy likes to go out to see the Yankees or the Mets or the Knicks or the Rangers or something, that the woman wants to become everything to him, be the whole enchilada and whatnot. Is that a myth in and of itself, that it's the women who more often want to change the men than vice versa? And what of just the idea of changing a partner, period?
Okay, I don't think it's the women.
No?
More than the men. I think they both would like to change their partners into their fantasy dream of who this partner is without finding out who they really are as a person. So when the advice that I'm always handing out is get to know the person well enough to fall in love with who they really are.
Mm-hmm.
And that effort, the amount of effort that takes is what we're talking about that goes lacking. So at first you think you're making the effort, but it's an illusion. And then when it comes time to actually make the effort, there's no time for it. So time is a huge enemy of romance and of modern marriage. And we are striving to make this relationship central to our existence on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're trying to ignore it.
Is the desire to change your partner, is this mostly in the sexual way, whereas if you marry, a plain Jane, a man wants her to be, pick Angelina Jolie or whoever the top movie starlet is now, and is it the woman, for example, who maybe her husband is a hardworking welder, but she wishes that he had gotten a college degree and could have been a lawyer? Are those sort of stereotypes where, like, do they still work, or did they ever work in that men want the women to be more sexual fantasy objects, and the women want their husbands to be more go-getter, provider?
I think there's something to what you're saying. I think that the sexual part of it, during the time when they're dating, in modern relationships, most couples are having sex while they're dating, and during that time while they're dating, and if they fall in love, then the sex is going to be great.
Yeah.
And it's going to be great by definition because that's all part of the package. And then when those chemicals aren't coursing through us, then like everything else, it comes down to having time, being in the mood, relating to each other, making the effort, being really understanding of differences, and accommodating changes in age. So I'm 5 decades into my relationship, 5.5 decades into it, and we're not the same people that we were when we started out.
Yeah.
So you may want to change the person, but they're going to change anyway.
Yeah.
And they're not going to. So my wife was 17 and a half when we started dating, and now she's in her early 70s. And so she looks great to me, but not like a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
And so and what would be sexually pleasing to a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old is not necessarily the case to a pair of 50-year-olds or a pair of 70-year-olds.
Yeah. And is it the unrealistic expectation that, say, a man in his 50s can't perform as he could in his 20s, or a woman may be a little bit drier and a little bit more difficult to excite? You get a little love handles, or the breasts sag a little bit. Is it mostly those kinds of expectations, the unreal, that what and who we were when we met will always be, and 15, 20, 30 years later, people are, they still have these delusions?
I think that it's hard to talk about sex, and that people don't share their preferences and their wishes with each other. And sometimes when they do, they feel hurt that the other person, oh, you mean what I've been doing hasn't been exactly what you want? And the conversation is just hard to engage and hard to understand, and it's hard to appreciate that sex can be a wide variety of things. It doesn't have to be all sexual intercourse, for instance. And what's sexual and sexually exciting can change over time. If you're not in communication about it, then there's going to be a problem. But this talking, the intimacy, requires higher levels of talking and sharing. And like the conversation we're having now would be great for a couple to have about their sexual relationship.
Yeah.
But how many people are going to sit down for an hour and really discuss their sexual relationship?
Yeah.
Probably none.
And we're talking about sex, but since you're talking about, I've always thought that conversation and the ability to relate, even if you're talking about life and the meaning of the cosmos, or just talking about your favorite sports team, is in the long term even more important than the sexual aspect. And since we've talked a little bit about the sexual, let's talk about some of those deeper things. are most of the problems based upon sexual or love misexpectations, or are they about deeper things, like someone maybe was molested as a child, or maybe they were neglected, or maybe they grew up and they were fat or wore glasses and were made fun of, and this person has, you know, a 55-year-old woman or man is still carrying the 8-year-old child that sat at the back of the bus within them, and that is that a bigger problem than the sex stuff in a lot of relationships?
In some relationships,
Yeah.
it depends on whether they've been resolved or not. So we these are what we would think of as intervening variables. So if you talk about in interviewing a couple, we'll talk about their relationship and what they're doing in their relationship, and how they're affecting each other, and then we'll worry about intervening variables, things that make the relationship very, very difficult. No time, not wanting to talk at all, having physical problems, having pain in their life, and then psychological problems left over from childhood, drug problems, drinking problems. All these are issues that really have to be addressed outside of the relationship. And so when a person brings them to the table, it's hard to resolve it between the people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an individual responsibility to take care of our own business, so that we come to the relationship, out of the miasma of the romantic love, we're coming to this relationship as ourselves, and we need to be able to be open to the relationship. And if we are plagued by our own personal problems, they're going to plague the marriage, obviously.
The final one of the romantic myths, number 3, that you have is that romantic love lasts forever. And we've talked about some of the sexual aspects, and we've talked about some of more of the relationship aspects. It seems to me that this third myth is somehow intertwined more strongly with religious beliefs, the religious idea going back to, you know, the Abrahamic faiths, that we meet one partner, you know, Adam and Eve paired off, and so on and so forth. That we are bound to someone, that we have spiritual entanglements with a person that goes beyond looks or sex or whatnot. That there's something holy about a union. Is that third myth, do you think, more directly tied to religious traditions about love and marriage?
I think my interpretation of it, I'm sure it's connected to those things, but in my interpretation of it, it goes back to when you fell in love. And there is, in that biochemical experience, there is a sense of eternity about it. It just feels that you're caught in forever. And the shock of coming out of that feeling and down to earth, which is going to happen sooner or later to most couples, is very, very disturbing. People feel betrayed. The difficulty in all of this is the sense of betrayal. The difficulty in the illusions that come from romantic love is not being in love and trying to get it back again. That part is great. The part that hurts is the feeling betrayed by life and feeling betrayed by our partner for not meeting our unrealistic expectations.
Yeah. And yet there seems to be some sort of cultural schizophrenia about the idea of romantic love lasting forever, because if you look back culturally, go back even before the Christian era, you have the Greek classical myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. You have Shakespeare 2,000 years later with Romeo and Juliet. In the last century, you have West Side Story, and many different variations and iterations of this idea of young love, doomed love, that romantic love, even though we want it to last forever, is bound to crash and burn in the most horrible, masochistic ways possible. Where does that schizophrenia emerge from, and what bearing do you think that has upon the love or the passion going out of these relationships?
I think that the difficulty began in the 50s when we started to have the custom of getting divorced, where there was enough economic independence for people to afford to get divorced. And when that started, we went through a big period. So we're marrying for romantic love, not for purely economic reasons and not because of religious reasons. And so we're picking each other out because we fall in love. And then we're expecting this to last. It falls by the wayside. Resentment and other difficulties start to crop up in the relationship. We don't deal with them, and it reaches a crisis point. Somebody has an affair, some other form of betrayal. We're feeling betrayed over and over again because each of these myths we believed in turned out not to be true, and we're not doing anything about it. And then there's no custom of what do you do to really get love in your life? How do you really sustain it over a long period of time? And it's not going to sustain just because you fell in love. You got to do something about it. And so the people fall out of love. They fall into resentment, disappointment, even betrayal. And then they can afford to get divorced, and they do that and start over again. If their parents were divorced, of course, the chances are greater that they're going to get divorced because they've already seen it happen. But it's hardly a rare occurrence in our culture, and I don't know that it's in and of itself such a terrible thing. But it is very, very, very painful to the people going through it, and very disruptive and extraordinarily expensive.
How about let's just talk briefly on the children and end this first segment. You talked about children sort of recapitulating some of the parental flaws, and we see this with child abuse. Often a child abused that is abused becomes an abuser, either sexual or physical or neglectful. Someone whose father left them when they were 7 maybe often walks out on their child. You know, a mother who's an alcoholic. You know, there's some biological things there is more likely to, you know, have some kids who may be alcoholics. What is the way that you help, say, someone break out of that cycle, especially when it comes to romantic love? If they've seen that their mother divorced their father, maybe it was married a couple of other times that ended in divorce, and do they feel doomed that they can't do it? And how do you reconcile with a person like that?
Unfortunately, we're stuck trying to use rational thought as a therapy technique. But basically, our motto is don't pass it on. We try to make that a rallying cry for people to look at what went wrong that they witnessed in their parents' marriage, or how their parents treated them, or people, or their siblings, or how they were allowed to treat their siblings themselves. And we say, look at your own children and at least see what you can do to not repeat the same painful experiences that you had as a child.
Okay. Well, let's end this first segment since we've sort of defined some of the pros and cons of romantic love. I want to take it out into a bit larger of a cultural context in the next segment, and we'll do that in a moment. I am speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Title. drjeffreytitle.com is his website. He is a psychotherapist who deals with couples and love and issues therefore entwined. Let me take it out a bit more. I talked a little bit about going back several thousand years to these myths of doomed love, the Orpheus and Eurydice, Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story kind of thing. But especially in the last 100 years with the rise of film and the rise of Hollywood, I think that's been intensified even more. We've seen countless stories of, you know, couples in love, couples going through all sorts of traumas. Do you think, and not only that, but commercials, the constant, you know, you wear this perfume and the man will come to you irresistibly. You know, if a guy has a clean-shaven look or he wears a certain suit, the women will be drawn to him. To what degree do you think that Hollywood, in film, that the advertising age has had a pernicious, perhaps, effect on the way that people relate to each other?
I don't think terribly much.
No?
No, I think it's because it's such a mixed bag. Sometimes they show a relationship happening well, and sometimes you get an absurdity that's just the life of, like, Sleepless in Seattle. Do you recall that movie?
Yeah.
So in Sleepless in Seattle, they never meet until the very last part of the movie, and we get this thing that they were meant for each other. That's another one of the myths.
Yeah.
This idea. So Hollywood, of course, good stories. These myths make good stories.
Yeah.
So we're telling people stories, and they like to see the stories. Romantic movies are actually difficult to make and don't often come out too well. So it is challenging. It's much easier to do the dramas about the relationships falling apart. And rarely do they actually show a relationship working because it's boring. The relationship working part, it may be interesting to the people involved, but it's not interesting to watch. It's like watching something dry or something. It's just a tremendous amount of intense conversation going on. You were talking about the importance of understanding, so that is an ongoing challenge to a couple throughout their lives to find the time and the interest and the effort to understand each other and really know each other. And so the movies sort of suggest perhaps that it's much easier than that, and that it's not something that you have to do much work at. And of course, movies have the advantage of script. We're struggling along in our lives without a script.
Yeah. Earlier we had mentioned briefly about arranged marriages. I wanted to ask about any couples that you may have dealt with or any research you may have done into couples outside who were born outside the U.S., like people who have emigrated or immigrated to this country and have had issues. Because one of the things back during the Cold War, of course, there was the difference between the communist/socialist outlook of putting someone, the state, the society first, even though it wasn't really put in practice, and then the American culture of me, and the self and the individual and the life pursuit of happiness, this kind of thing. Have you found any difference between American-born and foreign-born couples you may have dealt with? And are Americans more self-centered? Are they more solipsistic, or is that a myth as well? The individuals.
I think that there is an element of free expression in American culture, which is really hard to put one's finger on, but exists. Americans are inclined to be sort of warm-hearted and cordial, and freer in a lot of their ideas and their behaviors, and more independent, especially more independent of the families. So there are people who come here and find that an incredible breath of fresh air and get with it and just love it. And then there are the people who come here who are in immediate conflict over it. It's all very frightening and very destabilizing and unnerving. And a lot of the problems can happen between the parents' expectations and the American-born children's expectations, so that the children are raised in a traditional marriage, and which I think relates to this. My parents, my mother was British and my father was Polish, and they both emigrated to America, which they loved, and they had a exceedingly traditional marriage where the roles were divided and the conversation was minimal. The expectations were close to zero, except for good behavior. And they created a pleasant atmosphere, but their children were a mystery to them. And in some cases, like American family emigrated from India, they might be shocked to find their child marrying out of the religion, or not marrying an Indian, or refusing to accept the relative that they've arranged a marriage with from India.
Yeah.
And conflicts ensue. And sometimes they, create big schisms in the family.
Well, let's talk about religion a little bit. We touched upon it just briefly. America, despite having religious freedom, generally Americans are more religious, at least on the surface level, than Europeans. Often people have posited that because European countries often have state religions, that people feel sort of free to ignore them. Whereas in America, since we don't have a state religion imposed upon us, we are more drawn to our faith. Although I personally think that there are a lot of Homer Simpsons out there sleeping in the pews of temples, mosques, and churches across the country. But nonetheless, have you found that religiously inclined people uh, have relationships that differ in any way than, say, more atheistic, agnostic? And how about extreme fundamentalist Jews or Christians? Do they tend to have similar issues? Are they more or less willing to talk about it than non-religious people?
All that I found about this is that the church supports the relationship staying together. So there is in the pastor or the priest or religious leader someone to go to outside of the family to talk about marital problems, which is a helpful thing. And also the community supports a group of people supporting staying together as a value, which doesn't get intruded upon as much by the advertising world or the movie world or online social media. So there are real people who, and these communities will uphold the couples who have been together the longest as something to look up to. I don't know if that's really a real thing. It feels real to them, I'm sure, and those may not be the happiest couples who knows, but it is a value that is shared within the system, and so I think it does support the couples who want to stay together.
Well, let me just touch on that and one other thing you just mentioned. You talked about the happiness issue, and I know even putting aside couples therapy, I've often asked people, I said, we have this strange idea that the pursuit of happiness, maybe it's just an American thing, I'm not sure, maybe you've got more experience outside American culture, that this is seen as the sine qua non of human experience. And I've often thought, I don't have any children that I know of, but I've often thought that if I had a child and I said, oh, I just want them to be happy as people want to do, that's an awfully kind of shallow thing to say because, I mean, happiness is not a constant state. Happiness is something that occurs in moments. And if you didn't have non-happy moments, whether they're tragic or just dull, you wouldn't appreciate the happiness. I would want my child, I would want my life or anyone's life, married, single, or whatnot, to be fulfilling in some ways. And sometimes that might not be happy. If you're volunteering for a cause you believe in, there are going to be frustrations that you might think it's not all worth it. Is happiness at the root central problem? Maybe is that people think that marriage is all about happiness and that it should end up in happiness?
You're kind of hinting at the myth of romantic life.
Yeah.
It's the same topic exactly, just spread out over society, and it's disheartening a myth in a way. But I do encourage couples to seek their happiness through their relationship. You have a partner with whom you can discuss your goals and solve your problems together and put your minds together to achieve things. And I think that with the right people who are putting in the effort, the relationship is a big advantage.
Yeah.
But it creates, we have to accommodate each other and deal with each other and know each other over time. And this is, it can't be all happy. It's not all happy. Everything in life, not to mention that it all spins around the ultimate tragedy of death.
Yeah.
So it's not going to end well.
You mentioned about religious support for some couples who are believers. Have you ever encountered a couple that came to you after they had sought counsel from their rabbi or their pastor or their minister or whatever, and is there any kind of what you would consider damage done by the religious counseling that you've had to undo in some way? And I'm not asking you to pick on any one religion or anything, but is there sometimes unhelpful advice given because a pastor or a priest, for example, in the Roman Catholicism, isn't supposed to know about romantic love. So how can they really counsel on it?
Well, if they were that naive, it would be a problem. But I have found that many of the religious advisors are pretty sophisticated,
yeah,
and pretty understanding. They've spoken to a lot of people, heard a lot of trouble, seen a lot of problems, and come to a lot of the same kind of conclusions that we're talking about. So I don't find it a big conflict. I do think that if they're given to prescriptions and they're saying which behaviors are bad and not allowed and which ones are good and should be done, and without really listening to the individual couple and what their particular issues are, that could be result in a problem. But they come to me, and I'm going to do the same thing no matter what. I'm going to try to help them to figure out what they're doing over and over again that's causing them misery, how they are not doing the things they did when they first met that were successful, and the way that they've accumulated resentments and hard feelings that they haven't dealt with at the time, so that they're plaguing them later on. You can accumulate a lot over enough years.
Yeah. One of the things that you mention on your website, and it has its own page, is fighting for love. And oftentimes here in America, we have the idea that, if the plucky guy just keeps trying hard and he brings flowers on the 87th time he tries to woo the girl, he's finally going to get her. Does sometimes the fighting for love, whether it's at the beginning or at the end of a relationship, sometimes lead to obsessive behavior? And how do you define someone who's just determined to make it work versus someone who's delusional about it ever working?
Okay, so the fighting for love part is part of a paradigm that I use to explain the structure of a relationship. And so one of the four major factors in that is fighting for love, which is simply the idea that even if you have a quiet relationship which doesn't have the kind of conversation that I'm suggesting would be really helpful, this intense understanding of each other, at some point something is going on which feels egregious and hurtful. And I don't mean waiting to the end when the person says they're leaving you and they're disgusted with you, and then you start fighting for love, and can get to be what you are talking about with some kind of dangerous stalker kind of behavior might get involved and so on. My suggestion is about that to come up. So I'm saying that there are things that you need to do in a relationship that will make it good. Mostly talking with each other about who you are and what matters in your life and what you care about and how things are going along. Then there's having fun together, which is, after all, what the whole thing started out about. And very, very important. The fighting for love part is when something comes up that feels wrong and feels egregious, that people not let it go. You might let a lot of things go that could end up being a problem, but when you let some bigger issue go, such as, it could be a simple thing involving jealousy, that you feel jealous about your partner's attention to somebody else, and if you let it fester, you're going to end up out of love, end up feeling wounded and hurt and out of love. And I'm suggesting that fighting for love is when you just get a hold of yourself and say, listen, honey, I've got to talk to you about this. I'm feeling put off and hurt and distant, and I don't want to feel that way, so we need to talk now.
Well, let me talk a little bit about extreme cases, because certainly over the decades you've probably dealt with hundreds, if not thousands, of couples. And I'm sure it's a small minority. People say it takes two to work and two to fail. But every so often I would think that there's going to be some truly malignant partner with a fairly decent partner. And I'm not just talking about someone who's the serial philanderer or someone who has alcoholism or a gambling debt, something that's maybe genetically inclined. But there may be a partner who, at the worst end of the spectrum, is sociopathic in the way they relate to all people, not just their partner. And at the lesser end, maybe just an extreme narcissist. How do you deal with those couples where it's clear that the 90+% of the problem resides in one partner.
My method that I follow is to find out which of the partners is the most egregious actor in the relationship.
Yeah.
Who's doing the most harm? And so I'll address that person and talk with them about what the harm is that they're engaged in, and try to help them to see where it comes from in their past, how they learned that behavior, and to get an idea of the hurt it's putting on their partner. If they're at the point of not caring or liking the hurt they're putting on their partner, then they're in deep trouble, and it's going to be pretty hard to get around until I can get at how come they don't feel compassion for their partner. Imagine a relationship where the people don't feel compassion for each other anymore. It's not unusual, but it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Let me just ask a social question going forward, and I don't know if I doubt you'd ever have to deal with it since you're based in New England. With the recent passage of gay marriage, or I shouldn't say passage, the ratification by the Supreme Court that homosexual marriage is as valid as heterosexual marriage, that would seem to open the floodgate to a number of things in the future. The two most I guess, on the horizon, things that I can see coming us in the very short term, in the next few decades, this might open up polygamy, because it would seem to me if the state can't say that you can't marry this person because they share the same sex as you, it has no business telling someone that, well, you can't be married to two partners or four women, or having three husbands and four women in a group marriage. And then, and this is even more speculative, maybe more decades or a century or two down the line, if and when there comes artificial intelligence and we get human-like androids, eventually we're going to have that. Do you see some of these things down the line, especially the polygamy aspect, as coming down the turnpike, or have you ever dealt with someone who may have at some point been in a polygamous relationship?
I have not, but I certainly have run across people who wanted to have relationships outside of their marriage.
Yeah.
And I know of no examples of it working.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying.
You mean like open marriages where?
Open marriage was, talk about myths.
Yeah.
The open marriage was, there might be some people who cut out for it. There might be some people who cut out for polygamy. There might be people who would like to have sex occasionally and a roof over their head and don't want to have to be too involved with the person, and they'll feel perfectly, and they're not in love with them, so they're not feeling jealous. What do you do when you're in love? How the people that I have spoken with inevitably feel jealous when there is alienation of affection. And jealousy is a powerful, powerful emotion. So it's hard to imagine this really working amongst people who are deeply in love. But I don't know all cases, and I don't know everything, to say the least. So it's quite possible, and all this may happen. As far as it happening here is concerned, and opening that up, this is a constitutional issue. So it's going to, I'm sure it'll make its way to the Supreme Court one of these days, that issue, and they'll rule on it. Mm-hmm. And then we'll find out what is the law of the land at that point. And then I can't imagine the Constitution being rewritten to permit polygamy as an issue, but who knows?
Well, let me just get back to the main topic here, which is romantic love. And, you also had listed, facing fears, rejection, fear of fighting, and change. And we've covered a bit of that in the course of this conversation. Would you say, though, that the key for a successful relationship, marriage, or long-term relationship, some people just are together for 25, 30 years without marriage, is that there is some kind of deeper love than mere romantic love, that sexual love at some point, if a relationship is to work, has to be superseded by some deeper connection, some deeper form of love?
Romantic love creates the illusion of knowing the person, of being accepted. We can't get absolute acceptance from anyone but our parents. And if we don't have that experience in life, while we're madly in love, we have the illusion of that. But of course, real adults don't have unmitigated acceptance of each other. We accept each other when our values aren't offended, when our morals aren't offended, when we feel that we really understand where the person is coming from. When they're being reasonable, then we accept them. Otherwise, people get divorced, after all, when it's unacceptable to them. So we're trying to understand each other and deepen the relationship as time goes on, or it'll go by the wayside.
Yeah. I know we talked about romantic love, and I was just thinking there's a term for the love of God or the love of existence called agape. Is there a term for the deeper love between two individuals in a romantic relationship, at least at the outset? If you're two 80-year-olds and you've been together for 50 plus years, like you and your wife have been, is there a term? What terminology do we have for that longer-term successful relationship love?
I guess in stand-up comedy we would say doomed. But in real life, I think blessed would be the term. I'm not familiar with the professional term for it, but I would say that all of these relationships are temporary. They're not only temporary because we die, but they're temporary because you either make them happen every day, you invest in them, and you care about this person, and you know them so that you know them well enough to constantly be falling in love with them over and over again, or you're going to fall out of love and grow more and more distant from each other. And then there are people who can tolerate that because it's not filled with resentment. They're just sort of cooling it and coasting along to the end. Or there are people who find that distance intolerable, or it leaves them vulnerable to other relationships, so they fall in love with somebody else, and that ends up ruining the marriage.
Well, when I do the final segment in a moment, I'll have you summarize your thoughts. But could you say, are there 3 or 4 hard, fast rules or guidelines or guideposts, if you want to be a little less strict, that you give to advise couples, whether they're at the beginning, middle, or towards the end of a relationship, or the beginning, middle, or end of their lives together? In terms of understanding, do you have sort of like 3 or 4 commandments for a healthy relationship?
Do what you did when you were dating. This is my number son. The irony of it is perfect, of course. Here I am knocking the myth of romantic love, and on the other hand, romantic love instills the behavior that's going to put you in greatest stead as time goes on. So instead of looking gaga across the table and knowing you just understand that person deeply, making the effort to continue to look across the table and attempt to understand that person is going to make the difference. I also tell people to bend over backwards to be happy together. Mm-hmm. And you were making some interesting comment about the term happiness. Yeah. So I don't know exactly how much that means, except to find joy together, to use their relationship as a positive entity in their lives in as many ways as they can. And so that will change over time, but it's a negotiated settlement where you say, what do we have? What's the best we have going for us? How can we help each other to get the most out of life from what we know of each other?
Well, let's end the segment here, and in the final segment, I'll let you sum up any thoughts you have on relationships and the future of them. So we'll do that when we return. I have been speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Title. He's a psychotherapist. drjeffreytitle.com is his website. If you've enjoyed this conversation and his ideas about romantic love and life, you can contact him there. Or if you need his professional assistance and you're in the Massachusetts area. Doc, we've talked a bit about relationships, the pros and cons. Uh, what have you seen trending, say, in the last 10 years that's different from when you may have started? And what do you see as trends maybe during the rest of your lifetime in terms of couples therapies? Is there one kind of problem that has become more dominant in the last 20 or 30 years? Is there something that's receding? Where do you see sort of the flow chart of relationships going?
I'm pretty optimistic about it. I think that obviously people are still getting married. They're still falling in love. We can't help ourselves to fall in love. And I think that over time the issues haven't changed greatly at all. That people come in pretty hurt and pretty disappointed. I think, marriage opens up a world of pain and a world of joy, and which is not, there's life for you. And the world of pain has to be taken into account and dealt with in the relationship. And the people have a great need to reach out to each other and to see each other as their support and their most trusted ally. So I try to get people to get on each other's side and stay on each other's side as much as they possibly can, and open their hearts to each other as flawed human beings and accept ourselves that way, and our need to be touched and understood and have someone who knows us over time. I think that divorce has become less fashionable, amazingly. I think the biggest change has been a movement somewhat away from divorce. Mm-hmm. And I guess that fares well for couples counseling in the sense that the couples reach the point where they might be getting divorced and they realize they'd rather do something else than that. And they come in and see if they can't reach some sort of negotiated settlement instead of a divorce settlement, which people tell me is just a terrible experience, even though it might be for the best.
Yeah. And finally, you had mentioned that you're working on a second book. What is the title? When will it be done? And what is its main thrust?
It's in its final editing. Its title has not been set in stone yet, but basically it's Relationship Hygiene is the book. What we've tried to do is take the most positive steps that a person can take based on sort of a local, the meme about neatness now that's going around, and there's a pop book out about your neat house and having a neat life and organizing your drawers and all that approach. So we were very struck with how neatening up a relationship has a lot of the same qualities to it and the same advantages to it. So we begin the book with the things that you can do to make your relationship better, and then we go on to discuss the things that you need not to do. We're pretty stuck on resentment as being a love killer, and helping people to understand how to deal with their resentments and how to overcome their resentment so they don't collect them. Yeah. So that the relationship can last without having this terrible bag of weight on the bottom of it as time goes on.
Okay. Well, anyone who's found this conversation interesting or helpful can contact Jeffrey Title at drjeffreytitle.com. I will link to it below this video. And again, I just want to thank you for your time and speaking about romantic love, Jeffrey.
Thank you.